final presentation will be given to us by Matthew Wilcox, entitled The Production of Proselytizing Filmstrips. Matthew Porter Wilcox's greatest accomplishment, this is what he wrote himself, I think, either that or his wife, is his union with his sweetheart, the beautiful Amy Thomas. They live in Provo with their 5 pretty good-looking children. Mentioned Matthew works for the seminaries and institutes, is currently a PhD candidate here at BYU in education inquiry, measurement, and evaluation. I might add, you didn't put it in here, but I was on his master's thesis committee, and I look forward to hearing from him. So Matthew.
Good afternoon. I'm going to make a broad statement, so don't hate me for it at the end of it. From the Gutenberg Bible several hundred years ago to Instagram today, the way we use media can significantly impact and shape our world. The church has been right along with that. I think it's interesting that the first task Joseph Smith was given was to translate and publish and disseminate a book. Before he was able to organize the church, before he even got the priesthood, he was assigned to that. It all started with a book. And today we continue to spread the gospel through books like Facebook. See what I did there? Yeah. All the apostles have a Facebook page. And we get to younger generations, people like my students, the teenagers, are live tweeting highly edited quotes from General Conference that I can't read. Apparently it's some other language than English, but they're tweeting it all the time. You know, media has this ability to change our world and to change the way we think about things. Now, there's a lot of things we could say about media in the church, but I'd like to focus on one little slice, which is the production of these film strips in the 1930s. And so that we don't miss it, here's the main point I'd like to make, is that the church development of slideshows in the 1930s was driven by the specific needs of foreign missions. And a side note to that as well is that the solution didn't come from Salt Lake. The solution came from the missionaries that were living and working, especially in Europe and Great Britain. It wasn't this centralized idea that spread out from there. It was the localized region or area that had the idea that was approved by Salt Lake, and it was able to make an impact in missionary work. So here's what's going on in the first part of the 20th century. And I apologize, my presentation is very text-heavy, mostly because I like to see the words of those that were living and thinking and writing at the time. This is from current day, though, a historian looking back. Alexander Baugh says this: during the first 3 decades of the 20th century, British Mormons and their religion came under noticeable opposition. It is a distinct possibility the Mormon faith was the target of more religious persecution and intolerance than any other denomination during this time. Well, what caused it to be so? Well, there were, in the 19th century, the twin barbarisms of slavery and polygamy, and that second one of polygamy raised its head again in Great Britain in the early part of the 20th century. 2 authors say this: in the 1910s, a wave of anti-Mormon propaganda and occasional violence swept across Great Britain. Based on the charge that polygamy was continuing, the participants in the anti-Mormon crusade were especially concerned about the conversion of English girls. In newspaper articles and sermons and rallies and all kinds of public anti-Mormon meetings, the warning sounded. Among the headlines in the London Daily Express was "The Mormon Trap," or "The Deadly Menace to English Girls," and "Polygamy Still the Real Faith." If there were not explicit charges of hypnotic powers in many of these warnings, they often implied that the Mormons exerted a mysterious, unholy influence. And we can kind of see why they might think this. One of the major policies was that of emigration. You were converted in the church, and you were, for the most part, expected to travel to the United States and join the saints in Salt Lake. And so you can see how they put these two things together. Baptizing these people, they're moving away. Throw that in with polygamy, and you've got the kidnapping of young girls. I don't know where they got this whole thing about mesmerizing, but that was a popular notion. The other part that goes along with this was the rise of modern mass media, specifically motion pictures. Starting in 1911 to 1936, there were at least 40 movies that were made with members of the LDS Church as main characters, and the vast majority of the time they were not cast in a good light. The most popular, the most well-known, is probably the one that was released in 1922 called Trapped by the Mormons, where exactly what is described here was happening. They portrayed the Mormon elders with this hypnotic stare that, you know, these young ladies could not resist them, and then, of course, they carried them away to be married to Mormon harems in, you know, Utah. And this caused a huge uproar in England. Buildings were defaced. There was a branch president that was tarred and feathered. Ezra Taft Benson was serving at this time, and he was beat up and bloodied a little bit in an altercation. But even after it kind of subsided a little bit into the 30s, this negative image remained of these bad people that were coming to steal your daughters away. That was reinforced by these motion pictures that could be available to anybody. It doesn't matter if you were literate or not. You could be influenced by these things. And so we come to the 1930s with the Great Depression that was not just here in the United States, but worldwide, and in many parts of the world much worse than the United States. Fewer missionaries were going out, and they were facing this horrible public image. And coming onto the scene are two key figures in the production of these film strips that are going to try and change this image. The first one is Elder Joseph F. Merrill, who's a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. He is called to preside over all European missions. The second is Elder Gordon B. Hinckley, a young proselytizing missionary. Both come in 1933. Now, the mode of missionary work was to do this. You would grab your soapbox and your scriptures, and you would go to a public place. You would literally get on your soapbox, and you would call people out, and you'd try and preach the gospel. And President Hinckley said he learned to think on his feet during those things. He would go to Hyde Park in London often and preach there. But this is what Joseph F. Merrill had to say about this way of preaching the gospel. He says, "Our missionary methods are very inefficient. They are largely inherited. 75 years ago, they were very fruitful. But conditions have changed, and I think we have not changed our methods to keep up with the changing times." Basically saying, this isn't working anymore. And the second quote is a later article that he would eventually publish in the Improvement era of the time. He says, "The means for reaching simultaneously practically all the people of every civilized nation is already in existence. The radio and cinema are the modern popular contact agencies. But for proselyting purposes, the most powerful church in the world has found the cinema to be the most effective available agency." So he's got this vision in his mind of what missionary should look like, and it should integrate these newer, relatively newer forms of mass media in order to get the message out there. Now, when he says cinema, we need to clarify what he means. We think of cinema as going to a motion picture. But later in this article, he shows by context that cinema means something like a slideshow presentation like we're doing here. And he says it was advantageous because you could keep one picture on the screen for a long time while discussing it. Whereas with a movie projector, this may result in a burning frame right in the middle of the film sequence or other difficulties. But with missionary work, it's very advantageous. You can keep that up there for as long as you want to. You can have a discussion, and then you can move on at your leisure without burning the slides. So what he did to try and resolve this issue is he called this young elder, Gordon B. Hinckley, to serve as one of his assistants. Elder Hinckley was called specifically to be the director of Publicity, just 8 months into his mission. And Elder Merrill had him start writing the scripts for several presentations that could be made with a slideshow. Now, they didn't produce them there in England. There was what was called the Publicity Bureau in Salt Lake that was headed by John A. Widsoe. And so Elder Hinckley would write these scripts, put down a description of the pictures they wanted, and then send them off to Salt Lake for approval. They were supposed to produce them there and then send them back. Everything works perfect. Right? Wrong. They sent off at least 4 scripts in the year 1934. None of them came back. So Elder Merrill is constantly writing, petitioning, pleading, we need these materials, and nothing comes back. And the main problem was not that they didn't want to, but the general authorities were so strapped for time, they just couldn't do it. And at the end of 1934, Elder Merrill says this, "Of course we cannot complain. All we can do is to sympathize with the brethren and hope that sometime the work will be organized in a way to give them some relief from the many details that now absorb their attention." 1935 comes. Still no slideshows. Elder Hinckley is preparing to leave in the summer of 1935, and Elder Merrill has an idea. I'm going to have my trusted young assistant go in front of the First Presidency and plead our case. And that's what President Hinckley does. He gets back. After several tries, he's able to get an audience. He meets both with the First Presidency, the presiding bishopric, Brother Widsoe, anybody he can talk to over the span of 2 months. He is going at, like a terrier, anybody that is involved with church production of materials in any way, shape, or form. And finally, after 2 months, the First Presidency tells him that they've decided to start a new committee called the Radio, Publicity, and Mission Literature Committee. 6 members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles are on there, with Elder Hinckley serving as the executive secretary, or as they referred to him, the slave, right? He was to do all the work. And while their mission was very broad with publicity, radio, all these different things, he was promised they would be allowed to do this first, to get some of these film strips off the ground. And that's what he does. He starts churning them out right away. We know the work ethic that President Hinckley had. And as soon as some get out there, in the middle of October of 1935, Elder Merrill writes back. I'll go to that in a second. Here's a list of 17 different film strips that I have found that were produced between 1935 and 1942, the time that President Hinckley was there. So I just want to point out a couple things. If you'll notice some of the titles and descriptions, you might be wondering why these are used in missionary work. For example, Fascinating Salt Lake City, a guided tour of Temple Square and the surrounding areas. Look at the one right below it. Brighten Your Vacation, details the benefits of vacationing in Brighton. Okay. Sounds more like they're selling timeshares, but these were missionary proselyting tools. If you look on the other column, Forgotten Empires, an introduction to the Book of Mormon, before Columbus, a follow-up. But they really didn't say anything about the Book of Mormon. In fact, let me just pull out one little excerpt from the introduction to these two that are supposedly about the Book of Mormon. It says this: the Book of Mormon lectures were not designed as dogmatic proof of the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. No mention is made of the Book of Mormon, leaving the lecture to draw obvious parallels or leave them out as benefits the occasion. It has been written with the object of exciting the curiosity of listeners to the point that they will want to know more about early American civilization. If it succeeds in doing this, it will provide a valuable approach to a discussion of the book. And so we start to get a hint. If you notice this phrase right here, it has been written with the object of exciting the curiosity of listeners. And so we start to see the reason behind things like Brighten Your Vacation or a tour of Salt Lake City. In fact, Elder Merrill, shortly after the committee was organized, wrote his vision of what these film strips should do. He says, "We are anxious, first of all, to get contact lectures. These may possibly be followed later with doctrinal lectures as a further aid of your committee to missionary work. Certainly the lectures should aim to create and hold interest. Good lectures always do that. A little humor is a wonderfully effective help." That sounds a little bit like President Hinckley's later words, doesn't it? "We would not think of preparing sermons for the elders. The film strip should break down prejudice and arouse an interest that will lead the auditors to our meetings, to reading our tracts and pamphlets, and to conversations with the elders. In other words, to a desire to know something of Mormonism." So if we think about where these missionaries were coming from, for decades, this wall of prejudice had been built up around the missionaries. Elder Merrill says, my vision is we've got to have something, first of all, just to get past that wall. Let's not teach them the doctrine immediately. Let's just get them interested. Maybe we can get them interested through these slideshows with picture and a narration. And if we can do that, then maybe we can teach the gospel. Now, to highlight this point, he says, I know what's good for Europe in this quote right here. I don't know what anybody else in the rest of the world needs, but I know what we need in Europe. He says, we do not care to recommend lectures or anything else for American missions. Those concerned are amply competent to do that themselves, but we do believe that we have some idea of what our needs in Europe are. And certainly some of the pictures and stories that would serve us best would be unsuited to America. For example, one aspect is that a lot of times in the church we share a lot of pioneer stories. And sometimes those can be applicable to other cultures and sometimes they can't. Like in my stake, we have what we sometimes refer to as a Lamanite ward. It's made up mainly of people of the Navajo Nation. And pioneer stories don't do a lot for them. And it was the same thing with people in England. Some of the stories we like to tell in America maybe don't translate as well there, as was mentioned earlier. So he says, this is specific to our problem. These are the things that are going to help overcome the barriers that are here in Europe. There were ways that President Hinckley would modify these. Generally, he'd make a lecture based on some ideas that were given to him from the people in Europe. He'd send out a preliminary copy. They would try it out, and if they didn't like it, they'd send him back his criticism. And one thing I admire about him is he was so open to criticisms, to change it, to make it the best it possibly could to achieve the mission of the church. For example, there was a church history slideshow that was sent out, and the mission president in this area said it would be difficult to use in a contact lecture. I used it the first evening in Prague, and our elders themselves remarked that it is too strong for people who come out for the first time. And so, true to character, Elder Hinckley went back to the drawing board and modified it, and 6 months later he had a great new lecture that was really helping to engage people there in Europe. Now this was the idea, is that they could break through to these people. This was the vision behind it, but did it actually work? And here's a quote from one of the missionaries that served, that one of many, I should say, that say, yes, it did. This was, we don't know the exact date, but from the letters that I found around it, it's about 1939. And I'll just read the first line here. It says, as a missionary, I've had a great amount of success using our film slide pictures and the accompanying lectures. People are attracted by the idea of pictures for their entertainment and their information. Now, we started off by talking about how media can shape the world that we live in, and how the church tries to use that media in order to get its message across. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what impact did these slideshow lectures have? Now, it's hard to really assign causation or to quantify exactly, but I can say this, is that based on the letters that were sent in and the reactions from the mission presidents, they believed that this was, at the time, the mid to late 1930s, the best tool they had in breaking those barriers of prejudice. For example, Joseph Merrill again says, so popular are film lectures with our mission here, that unless the brethren at home put a brake on us, you have just begun on a developing industry that will provide us with one of the most successful tools in your proselyting work. The middle of 1936, just as he was about to come home from his mission, Elder Merrill had a conference with all the mission presidents there, and so they'd had about 6 months of getting these slideshows out there and using them. And this is what he said of that conference. Every president, and I think that speaks volumes, every president attending said these lectures are at present the best means of contact operating in his mission. Another interesting phenomenon was that this started out to solve a problem, a regional problem in Europe. It was the solution was developed, they were produced with that in mind, but I think this is interesting, is that idea there started to come back into the United States and started to influence the heartland of Mormonism, if you will. Stephen L. Richards, who was the chair of the committee, said this: the California mission has found them of such value that during the past few months they have purchased 20 machines. The southern states now have 20, the East Central 15, the northern 13, and the Central 14, and are generous in their praise concerning them. In several cases, elders have purchased their own machines. LeGrand Richards said this: you may feel that our wants are excessive. He was always writing letters trying to get more materials all the time. I need more, I need more, I need more. But our missionaries are having so much success with the machines and getting into homes, that opening doors for preaching the gospel, that it seems a shame not to be able to supply their needs. So it started off in Europe, comes back over the United States to the missions. Then in 1939, the first presidency, which had before limited use of these film strips only to full-time missionaries, opens the door a little bit to stake missions. Then the door opens a little bit wider to seminaries and other auxiliaries. I even read a few letters where people were showing these in sacrament meetings as part of the sacrament meeting program. And it just expanded from there. Maybe even some of you used slideshow projections in some of your missions. They were used all the way up through the 80s. So what are we supposed to take? If we're supposed to learn from history, what are we supposed to learn from this? Well, first of all, one of the things that I take away is that media and technology have the power to bridge some of the gaps and be a part of the solution to some of the problems as we expand out in the world. One of the other takeaways, I think, is that solutions to problems aren't always going to come from Salt Lake. They're going to come from people that are living in the areas. And while we may think that here in the Wasatch Front we are sending out the solutions all over the place, a lot of those solutions we found in little corners of the world can come back and impact us and influence us and help us in our own parts of the vineyard greatly. And I think that the use of media, the appropriate use of media and the way that we think about it can be part of the way that Joseph Smith prophesied that the truth will go forth boldly, nobly, and independently. Thank you.